Hello everybody and welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown channel. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Umair, who's a professional football scout and analyst, and we're here today to cover Paris Saint-Germain under Luis Enrique, as they have become one of the best teams in Europe. Number one thing to say about PSG is they are 21 wins, 5 draws and 0 losses in Ligue 1 this season, and we will get into the tactics and kind of what Luis Enrique has done with this team that makes him so important to the way PSG are playing. Obviously, they're in the quarterfinals. They've got Aston Villa over the next 2 legs, which they will fancy themselves for. They finished in the semi-finals of the Champions League last year, and they won the title and the cup. A lot of things have been made about how they've gone from being this superstar team to this young and hungry team. And I want to show that since 2021-22 season, they had an average age of 26.2. And in the next 3 seasons, that's gone from 25.9, 24.9, and then 23.7 this season, as Enrique coming in 2023, right in the middle of that kind of segue. And I want you to speak about the importance of having, these younger, hungrier players in this lineup rather than having maybe your traditional superstars. And if maybe a superstars is a bit of like a dying art in terms of luxury players in football.
Yeah. So, look, Luis Enrique's system and his style suit having players who are of that hungrier nature, of that younger nature.
Yeah.
I think, with any team, the players that you have can work depending on the coach that you have and the system that they do play. So, for example, if you do think about these sort of superstar players, they kind of fit the mold of a Real Madrid with an Ancelotti who's better at dealing with those players and getting those individualistic qualities out of them without putting too much onus on a high pressing system, for example. Now, you compare that to a Luis Enrique side, and his principles are fairly set. Obviously, he does adapt to his players' qualities, but he does like to see his team play high, keep a lot of the ball, press and win the ball high, and then be dominant in sort of that way. He uses possession sort of as a defensive tool as well as an offensive tool. And it's undoubtedly true that with players like Mbappe, Lionel Messi and Neymar, as brilliant as they are, it's very difficult to implement a pressing scheme team-wide as a collective that works in that fashion. And we saw that with Pochettino. He struggled to kind of implement his, famed sort of pressing schemes with those sort of 3 players. So under this new system, under this new manager, what we've seen is a very interesting rotational aspect with the team, and that's in its personnel as well. So look, no player is bigger than the club. If a player is not playing to the best of their ability, they're rotated and switched out because there's a lot of competition. We mentioned the likes of sort of Kvaratskhelia coming in, and people were kind of saying, look, why is he coming in? They've got a lot of top quality in the wing positions. But Enrique himself has highlighted he wants all of the players to kind of feel that pressure and be able to kind of be replaceable. So you've got to be on the best of your game to be playing, and that keeps the energy high, it keeps the players fresh, and it builds this culture around the club that is sort of setting PSG up for a good next few seasons in a way that's completely different to what they started.
If you're enjoying the video and want more tactical analysis and podcasts, please press the subscribe button below and hit the bell to enable post notifications. Just going through the transfers of the last 3 seasons, obviously in that time they have lost Lionel Messi, Kylian Mbappe and Neymar. They've also let go of players like Verratti, Ugarte, Xavi Simons, players like that, but they've brought in a ridiculous amount of players. And Luis Campos, who's the sporting director of PSG, deserves a lot of credit in terms of building the squad, because you look across the squad now and it's got young gems everywhere. You've got João Neves, Vitinha. Obviously, all the forwards are really, really strong. Nuno Mendes is one of my favourite fullbacks in the world at the moment. But they've signed Kvaratskhelia, Neves, Doué, Pacho, Kolo Muani, Ramos, Ugarte, Dembele, Hernandez, Barcola, Kangin Lee, Ekitike, Beraldo, Vitinha, Mendes, Ruiz in the last 3 seasons. And using that money generated from obviously the wages, the transfer fees of the 3 superstars, and kind of, spreading it across the team. And I want you to go in now into why having players in each position who are comfortable in all zones is really, really important, because we were speaking off air a little bit about Nuno Mendes and how they use him in build-up, but you counterpointed it with every single player can play every position. Not one of them has got like a set position on the team, and Dembele false 9, for example, is probably the one you'd probably start with.
Yeah, I think we can look at some of the biggest games of the season as examples of this point. The Manchester City one obviously comes to mind before any others, but generally, like most top teams and most top managers, Enrique kind of is favouring this versatility. One, because if there are injuries and if there are a need to change the system, you've got players who can kind of fill in and you get that sort of depth in quality rather than in pure numbers. Secondarily, it's very important to note that although this team looks very fluid, it's actually keeping its structure throughout the team. So the point that I kind of use to illustrate that is you've got these three players here, and obviously this system looks different in possession, but for an example, you've got your left central midfielder here, your left fullback here, and your left winger here. Now, if these players move in a fluid manner, this player sort of comes inside here, this fullback pushes on, this left central midfielder drops deep and kind of is that deep reset player. It looks like there's a lot of rotation in there, but the base structure still looks the same as it did before those movements. And by doing this across the pitch, you generally retain the structure in possession that Enrique wants, but it's very hard for the opposition to keep following individual players and keep their structure tight without being pulled apart by these very intricate movements of these players. And I think a term that I've seen used to describe this really nicely is zone occupation. It's all about occupying the right zones through your fluid movement and your fluid rotation. So that kind of underpins a lot of the attacking quality that we've seen from Enrique teams. You've got a very fluid front line, Dembele, Kvaratskhelia, Barcola, and in those three players, they can all play all three positions of the front line. In games, it's not uncommon to see both wingers switch position or Dembele come out to the right wing and leave this space vacated in its entirety. You also get him dropping deep, and it makes it difficult for the opposition centre-backs to know whether they do step out or they leave some space in here for him to try and receive. So in its fluidity, there's still generally a good structure, which is what I think people kind of miss at times in kind of making the question, is it strictly positional and strictly...
or is it free?
Or is it free? You can kind of have both, and this is a very good balance in doing so.
I think it's interesting how PSG don't really play with a distinct number 10 or number 6. Like it's almost like a flat midfield 3, and they've not got a destroyer in one position, or a number 10 who's a creative wizard. They've just got 3 midfielders who can sort of do a lot of everything. I was actually pretty critical of PSG early on in the season, that I thought they would struggle in the Champions League because they lack physicality in terms of the duel winning. João Neves is one of the best duel winners in Europe, hands down, even though he's only 5'8", for example. But I thought Vitinha, Fabian Ruiz, I thought the back line lacked a little bit of height, maybe defensively 1v1 they'd struggle. Nuno Mendes is obviously a very good defensive player as well as going forward, but how impressive have they been in terms of like deceptive physicality? Because it seems like they never get, Arsenal beat them this season at the Emirates, and I thought Arsenal were brilliant in that game, and PSG tried to do all the things we're saying, and they did overpower them, and they did go through them, and they won the ball high. But against a team like Liverpool, it didn't even look a problem. So how is that the case? How is it a case of midfield? Like in the Premier League, for example, if you played that midfield, a lot of people would be like, get ran through. How is it that they don't get ran through in these games, in the big European games?
So there's a few ways. I think that the first thing that's important to mention is they kind of try and avoid the situation where you sort of have a lot of loose balls in that position. I think Thierry Henry's spoken about it. They're a team that face a lot less counters than they did in previous seasons, and they counter less often. They still use the quality in their wingers to attack quickly, but it's more about sort of slow patient build-up before launching the ball and letting their players attack in the big spaces. But by playing a little bit more patient, by focusing on high possession, you're often penning teams deep into the opposition half. And then on top of that, there's a very strong principle of being very intense in your high pressing. So these are all players who have good sort of first steps to get to the ball, and they're very intense in their energy to try and press the opposition. So the ball goes out, and they'll win the duels by sheer nature of surrounding all of the opposition's options and then winning the ball high. In situations when the ball does get sort of played out and there's sort of loose areas where they actually have to contest the ball in bigger space, there is some difficulty at times. Obviously, Neves is a player who can mitigate that. But one thing that's really important to note is the fullbacks. I know we often talk about the fullbacks as sort of players who kind of contribute to the attack or drop in as a central defender. But what they do is they often play in these variety of positions. They're both very physical, and they're both very technical in the ability to play sort of left back, wide left, or inside. We've actually seen Enrique mention about Nuno Mendes, the fact that he can actually attack the box like a number 9 at times, or he can play wide, or he can play inside. And if a team does set up higher, you often get some of your players in these areas here. And when the ball gets launched, in trying to win those second balls, they can go out into the wide areas or contest those duels really brilliantly because of their physical nature and their reading of the game. So whether or not Hakimi's there and you've got a player dropping in there, or whether or not sort of Mendes is a little bit deeper at times, you've got that physicality that kind of makes up for some of those sort of eights that are less physical. But they are still very strong in their ability to jump out and press. So they kind of make up for it in their energy and their collective nature rather than relying on sort of one destroyer to do all of that. Lastly, actually, I'll just mention the two centre-backs, very good and very strong. 1v1. I've been particularly impressed with Pacho this season because he looks very assured when it does come to him. He kind of holds defenders off, almost in like a Gabriel-esque manner. So yeah, look, generally a good balance, and it kind of mitigates for some of their weaknesses by playing as a collective.
Okay, now moving on into an example of how PSG's somewhat positionless football actually worked in the Champions League against Liverpool. We've got the situation for Dembele's goal, which got on the equaliser and the tie, set up on the board. And I want to show you just why it's so important that PSG have this somewhat fluidity in their game. So we've mentioned how Dembele plays at false nine, so he doesn't really occupy the last line as much as you may see a normal nine do. And we've got Kvaratskhelia and Barcola who are holding the width, and they drag their fullbacks very deep when they run in. So what Kvaratskhelia is tasked with doing is when Nuno Mendes is on the ball or Pacho's on the ball here, they're looking to pull him deep. So if he's going man-to-man, Trent follows Kvaratskhelia in, and then using that dynamic, Dembele can also follow in, and then the midfielders look to spin behind. So he's going to spin behind there, and that drags him, which opens up this massive space for Dembele to drop in and pick the ball up. And that's what happened on this goal. And I think it's very important how they use this without it being really like a really long term or hard term to understand. It's called a counter movement. So when players run towards the ball, you've got players who can run off the back. And Liverpool actually struggled with this throughout the game because Van Dijk and Konate didn't want to step in to go with Dembele because that opens up these huge spaces. You've got the likes of Hakimi, João Neves, Fabian Ruiz, who can also run in behind like Vitinha's doing here. So yeah, how important did you think the false nine, not just in the second leg, but in the first leg? I think if PSG can get them direct runners in behind, and when they go like that, if they can use Barcola to spin in behind and Kvaratskhelia to spin in behind, I think sometimes PSG look like they've got all the possession, all the ideas, but they can never, like, it's really hard for them to break down these blocks, these stubborn blocks, because they've not got like a focal point up front. But I think it's a weird trade-off because if you stick a striker up there, then you lose the fact that they're so fluid on the ball. So how do you see them faring against like an Aston Villa low block, like without a massive talisman up front who can, you know, win a scruffy knockdown or something like that? Do you think they're still going to be this fluid?
I think generally you're still going to see similar patterns and things. I think the way that they try and get their goals is obviously through these movements from Dembele. I think it poses a few questions. So one, do your centre-backs follow this man, like you mentioned? Some teams don't. If you don't, then you're giving one of the most technical two-footed players time on the ball. And in doing so, he then occupies some of the midfielders. So for example, if he drops in, who kind of comes around him? Who picks him up? And one hallmark of this sort of Enrique side is to build up on one side heavily and then switch it quickly to focus on the other side. And they often do that with sort of triangles in this area. We've seen it often with Nuno, Barcola, obviously you mentioned Vitinha here, and they play very short, intricate passes because their team is predicated on this brilliant technical quality. When they've done that, the fullbacks have a very important role in this because obviously they can come inside, they can play high or they can play deep, but they often are also responsible for playing that quick switch to the far side. And teams often come over to one side. One thing Aston Villa do, which makes it difficult, is they put sort of six in their back line. So they are going to pose some challenges for PSG in trying to make that switch. But in moments of the game where they do push up a little bit higher, and PSG are good at enticing that because they play these deep passes here, going long, making that switch and isolating your players 1v1 is ideal. Secondarily, Dembele dropping in and then having your wingers attack this space in behind is a very strong pattern that PSG tend to use. And then thirdly, it will be a matter of your sort of eights or your fullbacks in these number 8 positions to showcase their quality. With Aston Villa and with teams who sit really deep, they kind of have sort of 5 or 6 in the back line 2 or 3 in front of that. And with Aston Villa, what I've noted is with that sort of 6 in the back line, 2 in front and maybe 2 more in front of that, they do give spaces in these half spaces here.
Yeah.
And then it's a matter of, can you get your best players to make use of that quality? Kvaratskhelia, I wouldn't be surprised to see him pulling out into those areas, having Nuno, for example, push on, and then having your player like Vitinha mark a little bit deeper. And then he's very good at sort of, in very congested traffic, getting a shot away. You've also got your Hakimi type players who can then play their crosses to the back post from the half spaces. So a lot of half space crosses, a lot of getting your wingers into these half spaces and getting their shots away. A lot of Dembele dropping out and trying to pull some players with them to then attack the box.
Right, just before we finish up, we're going to cover PSG out of possession, and it's a really big thing to talk about because obviously it gives them so much, potent on the ball because they're so aggressive off the ball, and they reserve a lot of energy when they're on the ball, so it gives them a lot more time to actually press. And I think one thing we've noticed a lot with PSG is this idea to always push the centre half on into midfield, and we've spoken just before about how Van Dijk and Konate under Arne Slot at Liverpool are a little bit more passive when going in, and I want to talk about how Pacho and Marquinhos are very capable of stepping into midfield. So what we saw a lot against Liverpool, and what we'll also see a lot against Aston Villa, for example, is when teams build up, they do tend to build up with 2 strikers, something Aston Villa do as well. And what this means is they go 1v1 against each centre-back, and that means you must trust the centre-backs to be able to follow that player into certain zones and dominate them duels. So when a player drops in like that, Pacho or Marquinhos has to follow in, and they are really good at doing that and arriving into the duels. And I think that's something that maybe Liverpool have struggled to do, and maybe what actually cost them the goal in the game was not following through with the man-to-man pressure in the back line. And that means it can often look like a really aggressive 3 at the back, especially if this player wants to drop all the way in and build up and really become that extra body in there. And then across the front line, it's a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-4, and we've got a lot of Dembele curving his run, and then other wingers and other midfielders stepping up into it. And I want to talk about how the 4-2 against the 2-4 is like a pattern that we've seen almost all the time, and how when the ball's played over there and the curved runs and it goes down the side, is there anything that Aston Villa could do that would really trouble this? I think they've struggled a lot in build-up recently. I think they're missing key players like Pau Torres, for example, and even Boubacar Kamara. When I'm looking around this area of the pitch, I don't really see how Aston Villa are going to get out of the press, especially maybe if they go long, but then they've got 2 really good centre-halves to dominate these duels. Yeah. Could you think of anything that maybe to manipulate this shape from PSG that they've seen so much success with?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, a very intense, very good press. It put Liverpool under pressure, and Liverpool are really good at building out from the back. So I think for Aston Villa, a team who aren't as technically able at building up out of the back as Liverpool, it doesn't make sense to play short. Yeah. They're a team that have wonderful outlets, especially with Marcus Rashford inside now, obviously Ollie Watkins as well. So one thing that I think Villa might do, and probably should do, is try and play on that quality. And I know there's brilliant central defenders in those areas, but what makes sense now is to try and get the ball to your wide players in areas where you got a sort of more favourable duels. So what we know is, at least against Liverpool, is Hakimi kind of pushed on against that left back, and it was actually one of the central defenders that moved out into these areas. Yeah. In my head, I think you should be getting Marcus Rashford into these areas. You should be going long to your Ollie Watkins here, who can compete with the best of the best in those areas, and then trying to run into these spaces here. Yeah. Obviously, on the far side, you kind of then have your players who can arrive later as your entire team progresses up the field. But when you've got a high press, one of the best ways is to play over it. Yeah. Then your sort of midfielders become paramount. And Morgan Rogers is, again, somebody who can pick up on those second balls and win those duels in there and kind of surround a lot of players. So I don't think they should focus too much on playing sort of globally. They should focus in on playing quite asymmetrical. Yeah. Playing in on one side, I think the left-hand side makes a lot of sense. Aim for your Rashfords who are running in behind your centre-backs. If they do push Hakimi on, try and get them to push Hakimi on by playing a little bit in those areas.
Almost like drag this and then spin like that.
Yeah. So what I'd do is probably have one of your players drop here, whoever the left back would be. Hakimi pushes high on him, and they're going kind of generally quite man for man. I don't know who this player might be, whether it might be an Asensio type, for example, and get him kind of uninvolved in the play for this aspect.
On the other side.
Yeah, and then you kind of isolate these players. You got your Watkins against, I assume, well, Pacho would have gone up there, but whether that's a Marquinhos or somebody else, and then you've got Hakimi's pushed on, so you're the central defender here. Vitinha is often one of the players who ends up in the back line here as well, so he's somebody you can kind of play on. But in general, you kind of have this sort of thing here. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to bait that press initially, but then once you do go long, I think trying to get it to your players like Watkins here, and then having a Rodgers there, and kind of making it a 3v3 in those areas with Hakimi out of the picture, having Marcus Rashford kind of spinning off there, knocked down and going long into those areas probably makes the most sense for him.
Right, and that's going to do it for today. If you did enjoy, please don't forget to like, comment and follow the channel, and we'll be back next week for more analysis. Thank you.